Suyat A. Mark Charles Yinish, yeah. Tsin Bake Dana Nishlin, to Tohiglini Bashachin. Tsin Bake Dana Bashache, to Tohichitni Bashanella. In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you always give your 4 clans. We're a matrilineal people. We identify ourselves by our mother's mother. So my mother's mother happens to be American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Tsin Bake Dana Nishlin, which translated means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Bake Dana. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I'm grateful that Sage began our time by acknowledging that we are on the land here in Colorado, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Ute. And so I like to start every session that I give by acknowledging and even asking if there are any Cheyenne, Arapaho, or Ute people here. Okay, we don't have any of them here, but I do this because I think it's important that we remind ourselves these lands were not discovered. There were societies, there were tribes, there were people, there were families here long before white settlement came and westward expansion happened. And it's important that we remember that. It's also important to acknowledge the stewardship of these lands that the tribes who've lived here, some of them for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that they've done for these lands. And so I'd like to honor and thank them. And so if we could just give a round of applause right now for the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the Ute, because of the work that they've done to steward these lands. Now, I have to warn you, in the next hour and a half, our 2 hours of time, we are going to cover a lot of history, both of the church and of the nation. We are going to discuss a lot of things that are probably very uncomfortable. Some of them may be things you've heard or you've had hints of before. Others you may be completely unaware of. At different points in the next hour and a half, you will feel uncomfortable. At some point, you may want to throw something at me. Other times, you may want to stand up and walk out. Try to resist all those impulses. But stay engaged. Stay connected to the conversation. Stay connected to where we're going. We're going to get to a better place. We're going to be able to have some discussion about these things. But to get there, we first have to get through some fairly uncomfortable truths. And so I want to start, and I tell people wherever I go that you cannot understand the history of our nation without first understanding the history of the church. And so I want to go all the way back to the teachings of Jesus when he was walking this earth. Now, Jesus was running up against some expectations. The people of Israel, they were looking for an imperial political Messiah. They were under the oppression of the Romans. They were not able to use their temple properly. They were scattered and they were having a lot of problems. And they were waiting for someone, a Messiah, to come to restore the fortunes of the kingdom of David. And Jesus was coming, and he began to fit some of that bill. He was born in Bethlehem. He was announced by in the stars even. The people acknowledged that there was something going on around the time of his birth. And even John the Baptist, who came dressed like Elijah, was looking for Jesus and was acknowledging Jesus was there. But even John the Baptist, after he heard stories that Jesus was out healing the children of widows, and healing the servants of centurions from the Roman government. He was so confused by this because this was not the image he had of the Messiah, that he sent his disciples to Jesus and said, "Hey, are you the one who's coming, or should we look for someone else?" Because he was not fitting the description of an imperial political Messiah that they were looking for. And I love Jesus' reaction. He turns around, he heals more sick people, casts out more demons, gives hearing to more deaf people, gives sight to more blind people. And he tells John's disciples, "Go back and tell John what you saw. And blessed is the man who doesn't stumble on account of me." Several times, Satan came to Jesus and said, "I can have all the kings of the world worship you. You just have to bow down to me." Jesus said, "No, that's not what I came here for." After he fed 4,000 with 5 loaves and a few fish, the people came to make him king by force. And Jesus walked away. "No, that's not what I'm here to do." When he's standing before Pilate, before his crucifixion. And Pilate says, don't you understand? I have the authority to set you free or to kill you. And Jesus says, you have no authority over me. The only thing you have is what my Father gave to you. My kingdom is not of this earth. If it were here, if this were my kingdom, my servants, the angels, would rise up and set me free. But you are not, my kingdom is not of this earth. And so Jesus taught this message that he did not come as an imperial Messiah. He did not come as a political savior for the Jews. And so the early church, the first, second, and third century church, when you became a Christian and you joined this movement that was started by Jesus, this movement that killed the Messiah, the Son of God, this movement that was so radical it had to be stamped out, you knew that when you became a member of the church through your baptism, your confession, your discipleship, and your community, you knew that you were standing in opposition to the empire. You knew that you were standing in opposition to the status quo. You knew that you were standing in opposition to the institution of religion. And that there was a good chance you would be persecuted, maybe even killed, because of your membership in this church. And now, in the 4th century, Constantine became emperor of Rome. And while he was emperor, he became a Christian. And he, actually his mother, were so excited about this new faith that they decided to Christianize Rome, to create a Christian empire. Now, this is completely in contrast to what Jesus taught. Jesus did not come to establish an imperial empire. He did not come as a political Messiah, and yet Constantine creates one. He creates Christendom, a Christian empire. Now, this creates a problem because the empire does what empires do. It expands itself, it protects itself through the act of warfare. Now, this creates a theological challenge for the members of this empire, the Christian empire, because this is going against the teachings of Jesus. He said things like, turn your other cheek. He said things like, pick up and pray for your enemies and to bless those who persecute you and to do not to go out and kill in the name of Christ. And so there was a problem with the empire and the way that it was using warfare. And so it needed the theologians of the day to find a way to make this new system work. And so one of the primary theologians of the day, Augustine, develops what's called a just war theory. Now, one of the purposes of the just war theory is to fight wars more justly. That's one of the reasons we have the just war theory. But the other purpose of the just war theory is to find a way for Christian citizens of a Christian empire to go out and kill in the name of Christ. And so when I first looked at when I looked closely at the just war theory, I realized the just war theory is evidence of the theologians of the day colluding with empire. But it's not the breaking point. And if you look at the teachings of Jesus, he is when people reach the breaking point, he's pretty adamant against it. So when Peter says to Jesus, you don't have to die, how does Jesus respond? Get behind me, Satan. You're not on the side of God, but of men. When the disciples walking out of Samaria say to Jesus, hey, they rejected you. Do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? This is what happens in the Old Testament. This isn't an outlandish request. This is what God does. When people disobey, he sends a prophet. If they obey the prophet and repent, he blesses them and forgives them. If they reject the prophet, God destroys them. This is Sodom and Gomorrah. This is Jericho. This is all throughout the Old Testament. So Peter and James and John, they probably feel good that they went into Samaria, because it's probably the reason they're under the oppression of the Romans anyway, is because the Samaritans are worshiping up on the mountain. They're intermarrying with the other non-Jews. And so they're probably the reason they're under punishment from God. And so they probably feel good that they went there in the first place. And then when they got rejected, they're kind of excited, right? Cool, Jesus, can I be the one to call? I mean, who doesn't want to be like Elijah? He called on fire 3 or 4 times. So they're kind of excited. Can I be the one to call down fire from heaven and destroy these people? Jesus rebukes him. No, that's not what we're doing. Something different. And then he takes them to another Samaritan village. And so Jesus reacts very passionately when people try to collude with empire. And so I was wondering for a long time, where would Jesus rebuke Augustine? If the just war theory is evidence of collusion, where would he rebuke Augustine and say, no, you're off the rails, you missed the mark, you're not where you should be? Where he called St. Peter Satan, he rebuked the disciples. Where would have he said to Augustine, you're missing the point? And I look through the just war theory, and Augustine's fairly clear. He's like, the just war theory, he acknowledges that the kingdom of men, Christendom, is not the kingdom of God. But he seems to take this stance of like, but it's better than being persecuted, so let's try and make this work. I looked through the just war theory writings, I looked through the two kingdom writings, and I couldn't find the point where Jesus would call Augustine Satan. Because I'm sure he would. Not that he is Satan, but that he would say, hey, you are on the side of Satan here. You are colluding with something that we should never be colluding with. And it wasn't until I looked at Augustine's writing on the correction of the Donatists. This is written later in his life. The Donatists are a heretical group. They're teaching heresy. They're not following the teachings of the church. And they've kind of been a thorn in Augustine's side his entire life. And in chapter 5 of this book, Augustine is reflecting on what is the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire. And he concludes that the role of a Christian king as a Christian empire is to prevent and chastise with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commands of the Lord. He serves him by enforcing with suitable rigor such laws as ordain what is righteous, and he punishes what is the reverse. So Augustine's saying the role of a Christian king in the Christian empire is to use the resources of the state to enforce the commands of God or the church. In chapter 6, he goes on and he says, it's better that men should worship God, being led to worship God through sound teaching, than being driven to it by fear of punishment and pain. But many have found advantage in first being compelled by fear or pain, that afterwards they might be influenced by teaching. So now Augustine is concluding that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to use fear, punishment, and pain to compel people to obey the commands of God. I am convinced Jesus would look Augustine in the eye and say, get behind me, Satan. You are not on the side of God, but of men. This is where Augustine goes off the rails. This is where the church, instead of rebuking a young Christian like Constantine and saying, no, we do not collude with empire, this is where the church justified it and went down this road. So it's no surprise that over the centuries, the just war theory morphs into what we call the Crusades. It's about expanding the empire, protecting Jerusalem. In the 13th century, we have another theologian, Thomas Aquinas, and he is also wrestling with what to do with heretics. And he argues that it's a graver matter. Well, so he takes the argument of if the church, if the state can kill people who break God's laws, he said it's a graver matter to corrupt the faith, which quickens the soul, than to forge money which supports temporal life. So how much more reason, therefore, does it exist for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but put to death? So if the state can kill people who break men's laws, he says, how much more right does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? So in the 13th century, after Aquinas writes these things, the church develops a new category of other that it calls the infidels. The infidel, it's a category of other. It's used in reference to the Moors, who are the Muslims, and later it's applied to indigenous peoples. Anyone who doesn't worship the God of the white European Christian church. And by creating this category of infidel, now what this does is this gets rid of the need for a just war theory. Because now, instead of fighting a just war, now you're fighting based on your theological grounds. Now you're fighting the other. You're fighting the enemies of Christ. And so it's out of this that in 1452, Pope Nicholas V writes out these words and says, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively become known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human, and the land's yours for the taking. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the African people. They did not believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world already inhabited by millions and claim to have discovered it. If you think about it, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. Correct? If you don't believe me, leave your car keys, your cell phones, your laptops out. Myself and the members of my church back here will come by and discover them for you. Correct? This isn't discovery. Not my church, the church I used to pastor. Sorry, I have to be very clear about that. For those who don't know, we have some friends of mine, Richard, Susie, Fanny, and Dave, who are from the Christian Indian Center in Denver, where I used to pastor for a few years. And so I'm very grateful they could come and join us today. But so you can't discover lands already inhabited. That's called stealing. It's called conquering. It's called colonizing. The fact that to this day, we honor Columbus in statues and in proclamations and in ceremonies as the discoverer of America, this reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is people of color, native peoples, are not fully human. What this means is the doctrine of discovery is a racist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Yes. Now, the challenge with this doctrine is it's been embedded into the foundations of our nation. So in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he said to the colonists who were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonists. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on in their letter to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason our founding fathers used this inclusive term all men is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. This, of course, makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically racist document that assumes the dehumanization of people of color and of native peoples. Now, a few years later, our founding fathers wrote another document. They begin this one with the words, "We the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union. This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, Article 1, Section 2 of this Constitution, just a few sentences later, this is the section that determines who is and who is not covered by the Constitution, who is and who is not protected or a part of this union. Article 1, Section 2, the first thing we have to note is that it never mentions women. This is important because if you read the Constitution, preamble through the last amendment, you will notice that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns who can run for office, who can hold office, even who is protected by this document. 51 gender-specific male pronouns, not a single female pronoun. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who does that leave? White landowning men. That's who could vote. White landowning men of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to white landowning men and white landowning men's posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. We have to reflect on this. We have to acknowledge this. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect white landowning men. This is why it was written. So today we act shocked that women earn 70 cents to the dollar. This shouldn't shock us. The Constitution's working. We act shocked that our prisons are filled with people of color. This shouldn't shock us. The Constitution's working. We get outraged that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This opens the door for super PACs, unlimited contributions to candidates. This shouldn't surprise us at all. The Constitution is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting the rights of white landowning men. Maybe you're thinking, well, we corrected that, didn't we? Well, we tried. So about 100 years later, we passed the 13th Amendment. What did the 13th Amendment do? Well, most people think it abolished slavery. This is what they think it says. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. But actually, this isn't what the 13th Amendment says. The 13th Amendment actually says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States. So did we abolish slavery? Where is it legal? Prison. Well, let's look at our incarceration rates. The U.S. incarcerates more of its citizens than any other country in the world. For every 100,000 citizens, we incarcerate 693 of them. The second highest nation is Turkmenistan at 583. And this is comparing us to NATO nations where we're about 5 times higher. And when we break these numbers out by race, they're even worse. White people are, of course, incarcerated at rates much lower at 450 per 100,000. So just to be clear, we've never abolished slavery. It's completely legal in our prison system. It's merely been redefined and codified under the jurisdiction of our criminal justice system. And to this day, we use it to oppress, marginalize, and take away the rights of countless numbers of our citizens and exponentially higher people of color than white people. Now, about 100 years, about just a couple years after the 13th Amendment, we passed the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was written in direct contrast or direct response to Article 1, Section 2. The 14th Amendment was used to extend the right of citizenship to anyone born on this continent under the jurisdiction of the government. Sounds like a good thing. If you read this paragraph, it says some very good things. However, Section 2 of our 14th Amendment still specifically excludes natives, specifically excludes women, and it makes full rights of citizenship dependent upon not being under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. So while this amendment extended some rights of citizenship to a few former male slaves, but it still kept them under the thumb of the criminal justice system, we forget that after this amendment in 1868, we still had Jim Crow laws, we still had segregation, we still had boarding schools, we still had internment camps, we still had mass incarceration, and we forget that in 1970, this very same amendment was used to conclude that unborn babies weren't human enough to deserve the rights of our Constitution, and therefore they could be aborted. What this demonstrates is, at the heart of our Constitution, there's no value for life. The value is exploitation and profit, the practices of dehumanization. And this makes our Constitution a systemically sexist and racist document that assumes the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. A few years later, we had a Supreme Court case. This is Johnson v. McIntosh, 1823. 2 men of European descent, they're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The court had to decide the principle upon which land titles are based. The court concluded the principle was that discovery gave title to the government, by whose subject and by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, and that title might be consummated by possession. So discovery is the legal basis for land titles. They then go on to reference the doctrine of discovery as a legal instrument and use that to conclude that natives, who are here first but are not fully human, we only have what's called aboriginal title, or the right of occupancy to land. Like a fish occupies water, a bird occupies air. and Europeans have the fee title, and therefore are the true title holders of the land. This case by the Marshall Court, this was John Marshall's court that decided this, along with a few other cases during that era, become the legal precedent for land titles. This precedent and the doctrine of discovery get referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005 in a footnote, the Supreme Court in the City of Sherrill versus the United Nations of New York references the doctrine of discovery as a legal instrument. This, of course, makes our United States Supreme Court a systemically racist court that to this day has precedent based on the dehumanization of people of color. Now, initially, the Protestant church pushed back against the doctrine of discovery. This was the Catholic doctrine. They didn't fully buy into it. In 1630, John Winthrop, Protestant pastor, was on board a ship. They were in what is now known as the Boston Harbor. They were here to plant the Boston colony. And on board the ship, he preached a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. In his sermon, he refers to the colonists that he's with as a city on a hill. He's borrowing from the image of Jesus used in the Sermon on the Mount, telling his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on in his sermon to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit in the bonds of peace. These are your basic Protestant, Christian, evangelical teachings within the church. However, at the end of his sermon, he's trying to persuade the people to listen to his words. And so he begins quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And God, Joshua, Moses are telling the people the threats and promises of their land covenant. If you obey me, I'll do these things for you. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. End of this passage, it says, but if our heart shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. So Deuteronomy 30 says river. In his sermon, quoting this passage, John Winthrop changes river to vast sea. Why would he do this? Well, they didn't cross a river, they crossed an ocean. So what's he implying? Based on the exhortations of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the model of Old Testament Israel, they are standing at the banks of their promised land, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, who here has read the book of Joshua? How does God tell the Israelites to take possession of their promised lands? What are they to do to the people who live there, the Canaanites? Kill everybody. Leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. Promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. I call this sermon the birth of American exceptionalism. That idea percolates 1630s for about 100 years. Mid-17th century, we begin expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains, past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, the Second Great Awakening happens. There's a growth in churches, a renewal of denominations. There's this religious fervor as we go further and further west. And early 1800s, the term manifest destiny is coined. This belief that this nation has the God-given right to rule these lands, this continent from sea to shining sea. Now you're saying, well, we don't really believe that, do we? Well, I want you to think back. About 2 years ago, Benjamin Netanyahu was giving a speech to a joint session of Congress. He was here to lobby against the Iran nuclear deal. And he was talking to a very divided, a very partisan Congress. Democrats and Republicans weren't even talking to one another. And he had to get everyone on the same page behind him. So towards the beginning of his speech, in an attempt to unify our Congress, he said to our members, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. To bipartisan applause. This is the myth of our nation. This is a bipartisan belief that we have promised lands. The United States and Israel have a very codependent, dysfunctional relationship. Very codependent, very dysfunctional relationship. We need Israel's Old Testament narrative of promised lands to justify what we did to natives and African Americans. And Israel, the modern nation state of Israel, needs our current flourishing as a nation state with a manifest destiny to justify their oppression against the Bedouins and the Palestinians. Our relationship is very codependent, it's very dysfunctional, and it's wrapped up around this co-opting of Old Testament Israel's theology of promised lands. There's almost nothing about a value for life or justice or peace or harmony in that relationship. It's all about justifying exploitation and oppression and marginalization. So now that we have a systemically racist doctrine of discovery, a systemically racist Declaration of Independence, a systemically racist and sexist Constitution, a systemically racist Supreme Court, and a God-given right to commit genocide, now we have a bit of history we need to discuss. So I want you to think about the 19th century. This is the century our history books teach as our century of expansion. This is the century we added about 30 new states to the Union. This is our century we completed our manifest destiny. However, I drew a graph, I made a chart, I should say, and I mapped our country from 1775 to 2016. Every year in blue was a year I found we were in a declared state of war or armed military conflict against another nation or entity. Every year in red is a year I found us at war with native tribes. Below is the list of wars we fought against our native peoples, primarily in the 19th century. If you look from 1811 to 1886, we have almost 75 straight years of warfare against native peoples. This wasn't a century of expansion. This was a century of ethnic cleansing and genocide. It was during this century that we passed the Indian Removal Act. It's by Andrew Jackson. This is the act that allowed the U.S. military, in practice by force, to remove tribes from their lands in the east to empty lands in the west. This resulted in the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee, the Long Walk for the Navajo. All told, about a dozen tribes experienced forced relocation, and tens of thousands of native peoples died as a direct result of this act. In 1862, we had the largest mass execution in the history of our nation with the hanging of the Dakota 38. In 1864, we had the massacre at Sand Creek. This was right here. We had about 150, 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children. They're encamped over a hillside near East, Colorado. A U.S. Army led by a Methodist pastor comes over the hill. The natives are waving a white flag of surrender as well as an American flag to show they're there peacefully. He orders all of them slaughtered. And later it's reported his soldiers are parading their genitalia down the streets of Denver. 1879, we have the start of Indian boarding schools. The purpose of these schools is to kill the Indian to save the man. Children are taken by force from their homes. They are raised in military-style boarding schools. They are punished for speaking their languages. They are punished for practicing their culture. The stories of abuse, physical, mental, emotional, sexual, that happen in these boarding schools are gut-wrenching. Susie Silversmith, who's here with us tonight, is a boarding school survivor and has actually traveled around the country sharing her story of what happened in the boarding school. Tremendous courage, tremendous bravery. Most of these boarding schools were run by the churches, and they didn't close until the 1970s and 80s, 30, 40 years ago. 1890, we had the massacre at Sand Creek. It's a bit more famous battle. We teach this a bit more in our history books. About 350 natives are slaughtered in a single day. Wounded Knee. We teach this a bit more. What we don't talk about, so here's what happened in the battle. The U.S. Army was trying to negotiate the surrender of one of the chiefs. And so they were meeting at Wounded Knee to talk about his surrender. No one knows what happened. A gunfire went off. No one knows who shot it, what happened, but a gunfire went off and chaos ensued. The Army, the U.S. Army, had up to 4 Hotchkiss cannons there. A Hotchkiss cannon is a 37 millimeter machine gun. Fires up to 70 rounds a minute. It's accurate up to 2,000 feet. They had up to 4 of them there. The people, the native people, they ran, most of them, into this ravine that was nearby to seek shelter from the gunfire that was raining down on them. Now, the U.S. Army awarded 18 medals of honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the massacre. 3 of them were specifically given for people, soldiers, who flushed the natives out of the ravine. 3 Congressional Medals of Honor. This is our nation in 1840. The dark states on the east are states. To the west, we have territories and uncharted lands. If you look on the U.S. Army military's website, you will notice that between 1839, you can look up Medals of Honor. Between 1839 and 1898, we gave away 425 Medals of Honor to U.S. soldiers who fought in the Indian Wars. And this is what our nation looked like at the end of that period. During this century, the white population ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million, and the native population shrank from 600,000 to 250,000. So we have to be clear. Between 1839 and 1898, we gave 425 medals of honor for the ethnic cleansing and genocide of native peoples. And you can go to the U.S. military website today and view these recipients. On December 19, 2009, Congress passed House Resolution 3326. This was a 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Act. It's a 67-page document laying out the appropriations for the DoD for 2010. Subsection 8113, page 645, is titled Apology to Native Peoples of the United States. What follows is this 7-bullet point apology. It mentions no specific tribe, no specific treaty, no specific warfare or act. It basically says you had some nice land. Our citizens didn't take it very politely. Let's just call it all of our land and take care of this together. And then it ends with a disclaimer saying nothing in here is legally binding. To date, this apology has not been announced, read, or publicized by the White House or by Congress. The challenge we face as nations is we don't teach our history. We teach the mythology. The mythology of our nation is that we have a legacy of discovery. We believe in equality. We have a history of expansion. We're exceptional. Liberty and justice here exist for everybody. And we are a Christian nation. This is our mythology. I want you to understand how deep this mythology runs. So who is this? Abraham Lincoln, right? What is his legacy? I'm sorry?
Freed the slaves.
Freed the slaves? What else did he do?
Preserving the Union.
Preserve the Union? He's white people's savior, right? He redeems white people. He freed the slaves. He risked everything to free slavery. He is held up as a beacon of equality and heroism and is constantly ranked the most adored president of the United States year after year after year. He is the beacon. He is the example of the white American who did good, correct? This is what we tell ourselves. So much that 2016, after Donald Trump got endorsed by David Duke of the KKK and didn't distance himself from it, Paul Ryan rebuked him and said, if a person wants to be the nominee of the Republican Party, there can be no evasion or no games. They must reject any group or cause that is built on bigotry. This party does not prey on people's prejudices. We appeal to their highest ideals. This is the party of Lincoln. We believe all people are created equal in the eyes of God and our government. This is fundamental, and if someone wants to be our nominee, they must understand this. Well, there are 2 Abraham Lincolns. You may or may not know this. We have mythological Abraham Lincoln, we have historically accurate Abraham Lincoln. We all know mythological Abraham Lincoln. This is him right here. I want to introduce you to historically accurate Abraham Lincoln. So in 1858, Abraham Lincoln was in a very hotly contested Senate race against Judge Douglas. Thank you, Stephen Douglas. And there was a perception among Lincoln that he was bending to the slaves. And so early in this debate, he gave a speech. And in his speech, he said, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." To applause. "That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters of jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races of living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." In the fourth debate, a month later, he reiterated himself almost verbatim, saying pretty much the exact same thing. After his inauguration in 1861, he felt the need to address his thoughts of the slaves and equality and race again. And at his inauguration, he said, "Apprehension seems to exist among the peoples of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property, i.e. the slaves, and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of these speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." So at his inauguration, he says, "I'm not going to free the slaves where it already exists. I've said this all the time. And if you have any question about what I think about black people, go back," and he quotes from the debate before. Actually, from the first debate. This is the one he quoted. This is the one he quoted. So then, in 1862, Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, he wrote a scathing op-ed calling for the immediate emancipation of the slaves. President Lincoln already had the Emancipation Proclamation written. It was in his desk. But he was concerned about the northern states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, which allowed slavery. And so in response to this call from Horace Greeley, he wrote, "If there be any of those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I would not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." The second half of that quote is hanging in a plaque at the Lincoln Memorial, stating, "For everyone who walks through, that Abraham Lincoln does not believe Black Lives Matter." Now suppose that's in the quote. Doesn't believe Black Lives Matter. Now, so this is in 1862, fall. December of 1862, the Dakota people in Minnesota signed a treaty. Actually, this was in the fall of 1862. They signed a treaty with the U.S. government. In exchange for some lands, they will get health care, they will get food, they'll get supplies for the winter. And so they signed this treaty. Well, time passes. The U.S. government is not meeting the treaty obligations. So there's some warriors, some young warriors who are out one day, and they go into a white settlement, and they kill the settlers, and they steal some eggs. And they bring it back to their people and say, hey, this is what we did. Now, the people held a council, and they concluded, they're in Minnesota, this is the fall, winter's coming, they've signed this treaty, the U.S. is not meeting their treaty obligations, they have nothing for the winter, they're going to die. And so they decide to go to war, because otherwise they're going to perish. And so they go into a 37-day period of raids on the white settlements, which brings out war with the settlers, and then soon the U.S. government gets involved. And after 37 days, half of the warriors flee north to Canada, and the other half surrender to the U.S. government. They're immediately put into military tribunals. And at the end of this first round of tribunals, it is declared that over 300 of them are condemned to die. Because they're military tribunals, that has to be signed off by the president, who at the time was Abraham Lincoln. Well, 300 deaths was too genocidal for Lincoln. But instead of ordering retrials, even though these trials were completely a sham, he simply changes the criteria of who deserves to die, what charges warrant a death sentence. Under his new criteria, only 2 people are going to die. Well, now he's concerned about his white settlers rising up and getting upset. So again, instead of ordering retrials, he simply changes for a second time the criteria of what charges warrant a death sentence. And he lands on the magic number of 39. So the day after Christmas, 1862, 4,000 white settlers line up and sing hymns of praise, while the largest mass execution in the history of our nation takes place with the hanging of the Dakota 38. Demonstrating that not only does Abraham Lincoln not believe Black lives matter, he also doesn't believe Native lives matter. Now, less than a week after this, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Now, if you read the Emancipation Proclamation, it is very specific about where it frees the slaves. Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and a few other counties are included or excluded depending on where they are. What's missing from this list?
All the slaves in areas that are not under rebellion.
Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. He does not free the slaves in the northern states. Holding true to a promise that he gave Horace Greeley, or actually to the states when he responded to Horace Greeley by saying that if I could free the slaves if I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, that's what I would do. Now, in 1863, under the pretense of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's government and his military, of which he is the commander-in-chief, decided to use this period to ramp up their fighting against the Navajo in the Southwest. And they began a more specific period of raids. And in 1862, General Carleton of the U.S. Army gave this order to Kit Carson, who was an officer. He said, henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Brosque Redondo, or we will pursue and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or move. There can be no other talk on the subject. Historian Raymond Friday Locke, in his book, The History of the Navajo, records that with the coming of the first snows, Carson put his second plan of operation into action. He knew that even with the loss of most of their livestock and crops, the Navajo people could still survive the winter on game and wild seeds and plants, but not if they were constantly kept on the move. Again, breaking his command into small patrols, he sent them out to crisscross Dinete, the traditional lands of the Navajo people, until the Navajos were broken up into small family units and scattered. They could never remain in one place for more than a few days at a time, camped in mountain crevices or caves without sufficient food, shelter, or clothing. By the middle of December, most of the weak and aged had died. There is hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember the tales of an aged grandfather, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by the Army patrol or taken captive by slave raiders. This is the U.S. Army that has Abraham Lincoln as their commander-in-chief. And in 1864, another one of his officers, Shivington, committed the massacre at Sand Creek and slaughtered 200 Cheyenne, Arapaho men, women, and children, and then paraded their genitalia down the streets of Denver. This is under the command of President Abraham Lincoln. Andrew Jackson may have written the Indian removal policy. He may have initiated the Trail of Tears. But Abraham Lincoln continued this policy and initiated the Long Walk and signed the death warrants for the Dakota 38 and had one of his officers under his command commit the act of Sand Creek. Shivington wasn't even court-martialed. There was an investigation, he was reprimanded, and then allowed to retire. And then, for his final song and dance, the 13th Amendment, which doesn't abolish slavery. It keeps it legal in our criminal justice system. And to this day is used in 1850. We had 872,000 African American male slaves over the age of 15. In 2013, we had 526,000 African American men serving time in state and federal correctional facilities, 877,000 African American men on probation, and 280,000 African American male parolees. That's 1.68 million African American men under state and federal criminal justice supervision. That is almost twice as many as we had enslaved in 1850. Abraham Lincoln has to be one of our most white supremacist, racist, ethnic cleansing, genocidal presidents I've ever read about. And we hold him up as a hero. The problem is we don't teach the history of our country, we teach mythology. Our mythology of discovery is actually a history of dehumanization. Our mythology of equality is only for a select few. The mythology says expansion, the history says ethnic cleansing. The mythology says exceptionalism, the history says genocide. The mythology says liberty and justice for all. The history says white land owning men is who gets liberty and justice. The mythology says Christian nation, but the history says Christendom. Now maybe you're thinking that's strong, but I want you to think back to about a year ago, actually last summer. There was a terrorist attack in London, and a car was driven in, and several people were killed, some by knife and some by the vehicle. And on that day, Clay Higgins, who's the U.S. Congressman from Louisiana's 3rd District, his website states that he is known for his refreshing focus on the power of the individual to be redeemed. The day of that terrorist attack, this is what he posted on his public Facebook page. The free world, all of Christendom, is at war with Islamic horror. Not one penny of American treasure should be granted to any nation who harbors these heathen animals. Not a single radicalized Islamic suspect should be granted any measure of quarter. Their intended entry to the American homeland should be summarily denied. Every conceivable measure should be engaged to hunt them down, hunt them, identify them, and kill them all. For the sake of all that is good and righteous, kill them all. Clay Higgins, U.S. Congressman, Louisiana's 3rd District, June 4th, 2017. You know what's shocking, besides the fact that he said this? That Facebook didn't take it down as hate speech. I want to pause here for a moment. There's four more things I want to go through, but I want to pause here for a moment. I want to just take a moment to breathe a second. 2 or 3 words. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no good or bad answer. 2 or 3 words. How does this make you feel? Anybody?
Ashamed.
Ashamed, disgusted,
Sick.
sick, dirty, outraged, horrified.
Truth will set you free.
Truth will set you free. Concern. Deceived. Yeah. It's important to acknowledge these things. We have a carefully constructed house of cards, which is the mythology of American exceptionalism. It's the unifying belief of our nation. It's not a partisan issue. Both Democrat and Republican fully embrace the notion of American exceptionalism, and they both do everything they can to prop it up. And we have to acknowledge that when we begin to tear that down, it's shocking. There's a lot of emotion that goes through us. I want to do about 20 more minutes of lecture, and there's some things I really want you to understand before we go into some time of Q&A and some questions. So the biggest question is, what do we do? Where do we go with this? Well, there's an Aboriginal leader named George Erasmus, and he says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want true community, he says, you have to start by creating common memory. I think this quote gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race and sexism. This is what the Me Too movement's all about, right? Creating this common memory. The challenge is, as a nation, our white European immigrants remember a history of discovery, expansion, opportunity, and exceptionalism, while peoples of color have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, segregation, internment camps, boarding schools, and there's no common memory. And I think this is one of the things that we have to work on, is we need to find a way to create this common memory. We can't allow people to live in the mythology. We can't change how they believe or how they feel, but we can not permit them to live in the mythology. I can't make someone not be racist or believe in the lie of white supremacy. I can't control that. I can deconstruct the mythology of American history. And I can point out the truth and speak what it says, and I can create a common memory. I can't make someone not be racist. So the thing that I'm working on is I am deeply convinced that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, Rwanda, and Canada. I call it Truth and Conciliation, and my goal is 2021. Well, I want to talk about this for about 20 minutes, and then we'll finish up here. So, many nations have had what are called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Large dialogues, official conversations about their history on a way to move forward. This is what we need, I'm convinced of, but I want to have a few tweaks here. The first tweak is with this word reconciliation, right? So this word in its context in our nation would apply to the notion of racial reconciliation. Who's heard of this term before, racial reconciliation? A lot of authors, a lot of institutions, a lot of people have built entire careers around the notion of racial reconciliation. Well, I don't like this word. It's not accurate. First of all, race is a human construct. There's no genetic definition of race. It's a human construct. And in America, we constructed it for the purpose of oppressing and dividing. So the black race was constructed through what we call the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule states if you have a single drop of African blood in you, you're black. Why do we have this rule? Well, blacks were the slaves. They were the labor force. We want as many of them as possible. A one-drop rule allowed for a white slave owner to rape his female slaves and produce more free baby slaves. We want to explode that population. So we had the one-drop rule. For natives, we created what was called the blood quantum rule. What does this state? You're full, you're half, you're a quarter, you're an eighth, you're a 16th, you're a 32nd, then you're bred out of existence. Why do we have this rule? Well, the mythology of America says these lands were empty. We discovered them. We have treaty obligations to native peoples. We want as few of them as possible. So the blood quantum rule lets us breed them out of existence. So race is a human construct, and in America we constructed it for the express purpose of oppressing and dividing, and reconciliation implies a previous harmony. That's inaccurate. It sounds beautiful, but it's inaccurate. So we don't need racial reconciliation, we need racial conciliation. Conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute. Reconciliation props up the myth. Conciliation starts with a much more honest starting point. So I use the term in all of my talks that we need racial conciliation. We don't need a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We need a National Truth and Conciliation Commission. We have to try to bring something good out of this history of crap. So to start this dialogue, there's three audiences I want to engage. The first audience is the church. My call to the church is to lament. I want the church to acknowledge that it's been in collusion with the empire since the fourth century. I want the church to acknowledge it's written the doctrine of discovery, and it's been using it to oppress people for 500 or 600 years now. I want the church to acknowledge that this is what its history is, and there's a perfect tool in that, which is to lament. I'm writing a book on the doctrine of discovery. It's called Truth Be Told. My co-author is a theologian from North Park Seminary. He's a good friend of mine named Seung-Chan Ra. He published a book about 2 or 3 years ago called A Prophetic Lament. In this book, he describes lament, and one of the ways he describes lament is he says it's like being at a funeral dirge. You have a dead body in the casket. It's not coming back to life. The reason you're there, the only thing you can do is weep. That's why you're at the funeral dirge. That's what, he said, this is one of the strongest components of lament. We have 500 years of dead bodies in caskets. They're not coming back to life. We can't undo the horrors of boarding school. We can't undo the genocide we've committed. We have to lament those. We have to weep over them. We have to just acknowledge the severe brokenness that we're sitting in. Now, if you read the scriptures, whenever the people of God lament, he always shows up. Always. He doesn't come quickly, but he always shows up. Now, the American church has the hardest time lamenting because it's difficult to lament when you believe in your own exceptionalism. There's no space to acknowledge the past. So we maybe have a song of lament or a service of lament, but we don't stay in lament long enough to ever meet God there. We have to bring ourselves out of that really, really quickly because it's horrifying to us. So I'm calling the church into a season of lament. The next group of people I want to talk to are communities of color. My message to communities of color is about trauma. So who here has heard of PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. It's an individual diagnosis for a person who's experienced a horrifying event. It has physical, mental, relational, all-encompassing symptoms. But it's an individual diagnosis. This person who had this experience is suffering from post-traumatic stress. And maybe it's even to the level of a disorder. It's really causing problems within their life. It's an individual diagnosis for a person who's experienced a horrifying event, the victim of a horrifying event. Now, there's another trauma out there that we call historical trauma. So historical trauma, this is not an individual diagnosis. This is how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. It's actually developed by psychologists to understand the dissatisfaction in Native communities. Coming out of boarding schools and Indian removal, there's deep dissatisfaction within our communities, and psychologists have used this historical trauma to understand that. So you don't say that person has historical trauma. This is how you understand the community's response to it. And you can apply it also, and it has been applied to African American, to Asian American, to Jewish communities. I mean, you can see the historical trauma when you have an oppressed group of people. So I call historical trauma, and it's actually been proven that it's passed down generation to generation. So it doesn't end with the generation that was traumatized. It gets passed down from one generation to the next. It's been proven to do this. So I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of PTSD. Does that make sense? Now there's another trauma that most of you probably have not heard of, and this is called PITS, Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress. Rachel McNair wrote a book on this in 2002, and she identifies PITS as being like PTSD in every way, shape, and form, except instead of afflicting the victim of a horrifying event, PITS afflicts the perpetrator. It's perpetration-induced traumatic stress. So this is what happens to the drone pilot who's destroying villages. This is what happens to the guy who's dropping nuclear bombs. This is what happens to the guy who's out murdering and raping. This is perpetration-induced traumatic stress. She actually utilizes a very comprehensive study on Vietnam veterans when she wrote this book, and she looked closely at this quote by Socrates, who says, "The doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer." So I hypothesize if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation, which we call historical trauma, which afflicts our oppressed communities of color, it would make perfect sense to me that PITS would also have a multi-generational communal manifestation, which I hypothesize is the trauma that we see afflicting white America. Because you cannot build a nation on 500 years of dehumanizing injustice without traumatizing yourself. Now, I'm not trying to convince people, the white people, they're traumatized. I'm trying to convince people of color that white people are traumatized. My goal is to treat white people as traumatized. So the first symptom of trauma is shock and denial. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, right? Anyone knew that full history on Lincoln? Shock and denial. Like, we don't teach these things. I refer to American exceptionalism as a coping mechanism for a nation in deep denial of its genocidal past and its current racist reality. This is how Americans go to sleep at night. This is why we never ask, whose land am I on? We have a manifest destiny. We have promised lands. Our genocide is justified. This is how we think. No one says this intentionally, but this is what we tell ourselves. This is how we go to sleep at night. This is why no one asks, what do I need to do for the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Ute, or wherever else we happen to be living? Because we tell ourselves we have promised lands. Now, one of the symptoms of trauma, when you look, is this buried apology. So our Congress was so overwhelmed by what they did, they couldn't even acknowledge it. They couldn't even publicize it. We have Texas and Oklahoma stating you can only teach patriotic history. This isn't racism, this is trauma. They're so overwhelmed by what they did to become who they are, they can't even teach it anymore. Now, trauma patients have what are called triggers. A trigger, it's a sight, a sound, a smell, something that takes you out of reality and back into the chaos of the moment of when the trauma occurred. So someone who has PTSD from the battlefield, a loud bang, or the dropping of a shattering of a jar, or the backfire of a muffler can bring them back into the chaos of the battlefield. Someone who's been abused, maybe it's a certain scent or a smell or a song or something that brings them back to the chaos of when that abuse happened. Someone, a trigger takes you out of reality and back to the chaos of the moment of when the trauma occurred. So if we understand white Americans as another group of traumatized people, it's easy to see their triggers. So 8 years of a black president was a trigger, right? White America did not know what to do with the optic of a black man governing from an office they forced slaves to build. Without President Obama, we never get Donald Trump. It just doesn't happen. We do not elect someone who's this explicitly racist and sexist unless we were traumatized, we were triggered by something before that, and President Obama was our trigger. Any sort of national dialogue on gun control or immigration is a trigger. We're observing this now. You cannot talk about this without white people screaming at each other. It's a trigger, no pun intended. I refer to ISIS as a trigger. Now, why is ISIS a trigger? Well, they're a group of religious zealots ethnically cleansing a land to set up their own pseudo-religious empire.
Just like us.
This is what we did. This is why Paris gets bombed, London gets bombed, and white Americans make it all about us.
Except ISIS was created by you know who.
So these are all the things that I want people to understand this trauma. Because if we're going to have a national dialogue on race, gender, and class, if you want to go and talk about race in an inner city community or on a reservation and you don't understand our historical trauma, you're going to come in and start talking about boarding schools or talking about something else, and you're going to trigger our people, and we're going to freak out on you, and you're going to walk away perplexed and befuddled. If you go into an inner city Black African American community and try to talk about the evils of slavery, and you don't understand the historical trauma of that community, and you want to talk about reconciliation, you're going to trigger things, and you're going to get reactions you don't know what to do with. By the same token, if we try to address this history that I just talked to you about today without understanding the triggered responses of white America, we're never going to get this conversation going anywhere. The challenge we have in our nation is white Americans are put usually into one of two categories when we talk about race. White Americans are either labeled immediately as racist or they're fragile. Neither one of those are helpful. If white Americans are racist, if you're racist just because your skin is white, then that means there's no room for you in the conversation. That's not helpful. If white Americans are fragile and we have to walk around you on eggshells, that's not helpful. Think about with a counselor. When you go into a counselor and you're talking about some things and something during the session triggers you, and you begin screaming and carrying on about something, your counselor does not immediately assume that you hate them, right? They know something's triggered you, so what do? Do they yell back at you? No. Do they soothe it? No. They pry into it, right? This is what makes counselors so crazy annoying. They're like, why? What's going on for you? Why is this sound? Why is this smell? Why is that butterfly causing you to react this way? And they press in it. Let's talk. I don't want to talk about this, but this is what they do. They press in it. They don't let you off the hook. They go back. But what happens when the hour's over? Okay, put your shoes back on. You know, we'll come back next week. I have a lunch appointment. You're not ruining my day. You know? Go on, we'll come back. The problem is we allow the trauma of white America, the triggers of white America, to overtake the thing. We start coddling them. We start fighting back at them. We start exacerbating it. And we don't treat them appropriately, not as victims of trauma, but as perpetrators who are also experiencing trauma. Multi-generational communal manifestation of perpetration-induced traumatic stress. So I'm literally running around the country. I'm not trying to convince white people you're traumatized. I'm trying to convince people of color who are in the room white people are traumatized so we can respond more appropriately to their triggers. Because if we don't learn how to do that, we're never going to get this conversation going anywhere. It's never going to get past the first one or two steps. The last group, the last two groups I want to talk to, and I'll end with these two groups. The next is Native peoples. My message to Native peoples is that we are not the helpless victims of an oppressive colonial government. We are the host people of the land. And we need to conduct ourselves as that. We need to conduct ourselves as the host people of the land. I loved what happened at Standing Rock. We had hundreds of tribes, unprecedented in the history of this nation, of this continent even. Hundreds of tribes coming together, deeply committed. Did anyone go to Standing Rock? It was like sacred ground if you went there. It was so beautiful. The prayer, the ceremony, the sacredness of it all. It was a beautiful place. And it was Native peoples coming together to tell this colonial nation of immigrants, that you can't drink oil. Water is life. I loved what our Native people did at Standing Rock. It was an incredible step of us moving towards viewing and understanding and acting out of this identity of we are the host people of the land. The last group I want to talk to is millennials. Do you have any millennials in the room here? So my message to millennials, and millennials are befuddling the nation, right? Our nation doesn't know what to do with millennials. They're not joining churches, they're not joining political parties, they're not going to work for corporate America, they're driving Uber, they're doing Airbnb, there's this one employer, WordPress, it's one of the larger blogging sites out there. They built a huge office complex, headquarters in downtown San Francisco, very expensive. I read an article about 9 months ago, they're closing that headquarters. Not because they're going out of business, but because all their employees are millennials. And they're not coming into the office. They're working in a hammock out somewhere else. Millennials we don't know what to do with them. But millennials, I think, there's some parts of this that they absolutely get. Millennials have now surpassed the boomers as the largest generation. They're the largest electorate block in our country. It's the millennials who are finally beginning to move the dialogue on gun control forward. They are slowly beginning to understand their political might and their power by who they are. They are already decolonizing. So one of the challenges millennials face is they followed the rules. They went to college, they got their degree, and they came out. While they were in college, we changed the rules on them on how lending works and how Pell Grants work and everything else. And they went into college with one set of rules, and they came out, and they have $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 in debt. They have their PhDs, they have their masters, their doctorates, and the only thing they can get, a job they can get, is teaching adjunct at some small university for $300 a class. We absolutely changed the rules on them. And so they're responding by what? They're decolonizing. How are they buying cars? They're driving Uber. How are they affording houses? They're renting it out in the part-time on Airbnb. How are they decolonizing the financial system? They're investing in not Bitcoin, the currency, the whole thing that is called, the cryptocurrency. They're freaking out the banks. Like they don't know what to do with these guys. They're not joining denominations, they're not joining other things, and they, millennials, have an inherent value for pluralism. They have an inherent, they are what, so did you know it was in the 1960s that interracial marriage became legal? My parents were like the first ones to run to the courthouse after it became legal. Not literally, but they were soon after. So my generation, I'm an anomaly for my generation. It's my children's generation, who are now the millennials, who they are the fruits of these interracial marriages, and they don't even think about it. Interracial marriage is not even a thought in their mind. Now, I would argue that pluralism, I'm not saying it's a biblical value, but I would say Jesus set up the church to thrive in one of two environments. I would say he set up the church to thrive as a persecuted entity, and he set up the church to thrive in a pluralistic environment. I love the story of this rich young ruler who comes to Jesus and says, hey, how do I get to heaven? Jesus says, well, A, B, C, D, and E. Do these 5 things. The guy's like, cool, I've done them. Jesus says, well, you're missing something. Sell everything and then come follow me. And the guy walks away. No, I'm not doing that. I don't believe that. What's the amazing thing Jesus does? He lets him leave. He doesn't mock him. Hey, you're an idiot. You're going to hell. He doesn't grab his arm and twist. I don't care what you think. You're coming and follow me. You're going to like it. He doesn't change his truth. You don't have to sell everything. Just give away something nice. No, he spoke the truth. The rich young ruler, like, I don't believe that. And Jesus let him walk away. Millennials are great at this. Do they believe things? Yes. Are they trying to convert everybody? No. Their parents could not fathom being friends with a Muslim. Why? Because every interaction would be evangelistic. How can I get them to convert? How can I get evangelicals? Are millennials just like, yeah, I have Muslim friends, I have Hindu friends, I have atheist friends, I have Christian friends. They're not trying to convert everybody. Do they believe in truth? Do they believe in something? Yes. Are they afraid to say it? No. They talk about it, but are they trying to get everyone to bow to their belief system? No. That's the same thing Jesus did. The challenge is we think, the older generations, the boomers, the Gen Xers, we think our job is to make people believe rather than just to share what we believe in. That's the challenge. We are trying to make our nation Christian. It's the parents and grandparents of the millennials who are at the Supreme Court just recently trying to argue that they don't want to have to bake a cake for anyone they theologically disagree with. And millennials are just like, cool, my friends can marry who they love. This is the difference. And so I affirm, I love what millennials are doing. Because they're turning this whole thing upside down. They are beginning to decolonize so much about us. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can allow them. Just like I love how these high school students are leading this gun debate right now. I love that. I think we need to allow millennials to deconstruct how we do work, how we do economy, how we do, they're driving the gig economy. And I think we need to allow them to help us drive, how do we decolonize our faith? How do we decolonize the way we follow Jesus? So I'm going to end there. But the centerpiece of everything that we're talking about is I am really deeply convicted and convinced that we need to find a way to create this common memory. We need to find a way to get rid of these divisive colonial boxes that we live in and these mythologies that we believe and create a common memory. Because I think, can pretty much everyone agree, community nationwide sucks right now? Like it really does. We don't know how to talk to each other anymore. And yeah, the nation's never going to be Christian. The goal isn't to make the nation Christian, but can we at least have some better community? Can we find a way to live and coexist with one another without always screaming and yelling and carrying on about each other? I think creating this common memory. And I'm deeply committed to this. I'm working very hard right now towards finding a way to engage a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. Conversation that's on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And I'm calling it Truth and Conciliation, and my goal is 2021. On my website, my Facebook, my Twitter, I'm Wireless Hogan anywhere around the country or anywhere on social media. You can always find me under Wireless Hogan. These are the ones, social media I'm most active on, my website, my Facebook, my Twitter, my YouTube. But I welcome you to follow me. I welcome you to engage with me. I welcome you to ask questions and to work with me on this. So.